In the beginning, it still seemed distant, although somewhat unsettling, something we couldn't quite put our finger on. The full impact of a phenomenon we didn't understand hadn't yet, as far as we knew, reached our shores. Perhaps there would be a disruption of some kind, a temporary postponement of events, but we couldn't really conceive of our lives coming to a halt as we were witnessing elsewhere in the world. And then, in the time that it took for Jonah's gourd to come up in a night and perish in a night, the epidemic descended and blinded all our receptors. Here was a story of the transmission of a virus that had originated in a bat, found a staging post in a pangolin or perhaps some other animal, and was transferred to its first human victims. And it wasn't only the virus that took hold, taking away individuals before they had reached the full measure of their lives. We found ourselves in the midst of an epidemic of fear. In those early days, as we read and heard of the effects of a full lockdown in parts of Europe, the virus infiltrating nursing homes, and the increasing numbers of those taken into hospital and on ventilators, of schools and businesses and universities shut down, the economy collapsing, it seemed as though the world had come to rest in some timeless zone with no known boundaries and no end. All our daily frenetic movements, all drivenness and blind ambition, all striving for I know not what, all had ceased, and all the hurdles of life, all the delicate balancing acts of our lives, the fragile structures of existence that we had built for ourselves and that gave our lives a structure of timeliness, fell away without the imminence of deadlines. Cities became ghost towns, and walking became an obstacle course as we stepped aside or crossed the road to avoid getting too near to others. Suddenly, everyone was a suspect, a carrier, potentially guilty of passing on the virus. And with the daily regime of one government minister after another, flanked by the science, reporting, threatening, and confusing us with figures and graphs, rules and regulations, filling us with uncertainty and terror, we became news junkies, feeding our fear and emptying our minds of everything except COVID-19. This was the war that was eclipsing all other wars. For weeks, we didn't need to think about the nearly 10-year-old civil war in Syria, the multiple human rights violations, attacks on hospitals and schools, and the death toll of civilians, among them hundreds of children. Nor did we need consider the acute humanitarian crisis in Yemen, over 100,000 people killed in the last 6 years, and the 13 million Yemenis facing starvation because of a famine caused by the war. Almost overnight, the demonstrators in Hong Kong disappeared, and we forgot about the Christian villages wiped out by Fulani jihadists in Nigeria. We forgot about the Uyghur Muslims in China and countless other conflicts and calamities in the rest of the world. This consuming fear of the virus paralyzed us. How long did it take before we found our voices to protest against the proposed unilateral annexation of the West Bank by Israel? How long until we could turn our thoughts to the suffering and ordeals taking place in the world, poverty and homelessness, persecution, and the ravages of global warming, any respite in the early months of the pandemic eradicated? How long until we would awaken for a few weeks over the summer as the numbers of infections decreased and ally ourselves with Black Lives Matter, only to be herded back into what the French philosopher and social activist Bernard-Henri Lévy describes as a parallel universe in which nothing else, anywhere, was news. There were times when it seemed as though we had been transported into another dimension, like a dream or a nightmare. Perhaps tomorrow we would awake and all would be as before, streets choked with traffic, the tubes surging with human beings, the stock market exploding and disintegrating with the first fast-changing event of our lives. At other times, it seemed as though we were on some journey of grief, the numbness of shock and trauma caused by our own illness or our encounter with those who had suffered, and our suddenly severed bonds with those who had died. I think we know in our heart of hearts that our mourning has scarcely begun, that perhaps only now we can begin to pare away the seams of suffering and anguish that have accumulated over these past months. And 6 months on, the less cavalier among us cannot rid ourselves of a stricken kind of desperation that we too might lose our own lives or the lives of loved ones because of one careless instant. And then there were moments, guilty moments, of relief that a silence and stillness had at last come, that the world could breathe again, that we seemed, falsely as it happened, to be resting in peace, our existence ruptured by the spiked spheres of the coronavirus. There were those who piously dared to believe that the virus had come to punish us for the damage we had inflicted on the world, that the world had somehow been propelled backwards in time and was heading towards some last judgment, the wicked punished by a plague, spurned by a God whose will we had disobeyed and whose creation we had ruined. It is true, there were and are moments of solidarity and mutual assistance, but these were tinged with a sense that our gratitude and our clapping for those who were on the front line, whose work had suddenly become more dangerous, would in time be forgotten. In early June, I was allowed to visit my 93-year-old colleague and friend, Rabbi Willie Wolf. An explosive storm in February had torn down the chimney and part of the roof of his bungalow, and he had temporarily taken refuge in a nursing home in Henley-on-Thames, 5 miles from the village where he lived alone. By the time his house was repaired, the care home was in lockdown. Then the home began to allow friends to visit outside in the garden. On the first occasion, waiting to be admitted, I was told to take a chair and sit in the street by a small car park on the other side of the railings and gate. Willie was brought down on the arm of a carer, and we sat talking to each other, the iron railings between us. It was demeaning and humiliating for him, and he was struggling to hear and see. I could see that his health was beginning to fail. He was desperately lonely and couldn't understand why he couldn't be moved to a place closer to his friends in London. By the end of June, he had stopped eating and was brought downstairs in a wheelchair. We were allowed to sit just inside the front entrance. It was heartbreaking to see how weak and thin he was. In the last weeks of his life, unable to move, we were finally allowed to see him in his room. He died on July the 8th. He said he wanted to live until he was 100, but his vitality had been crushed, his spark extinguished. I believe he died of loneliness. Isolation, fewer visitors, the resulting onset of depression affected him and many others. The Office of National Statistics reported a 52.2% increase in excess deaths of people dying of dementia and Alzheimer's disease during the period of the lockdown, when families were unable to visit loved ones in home or hospitals. Perhaps this is not the moment to speak in such unsparing terms about this animal-born plague and its curse of death and disease, or the blindness and fear that have infected us, even more, I think, than its microscopic droplets. For as much as humanity revealed its selfishness and greed in the first weeks and months of the pandemic, clearing supermarket shelves of essentials, we have also seen unbounded kindness and generosity, exemplified in our own congregation by a community care team, bolstered by over 100 new volunteers, in addition to all our existing volunteers who have kept in touch with so many. And yet, this festival of Yom Kippur demands of us that unsparing look at ourselves, not with self-congratulation and complacency, but in earnest contemplation of how we can repair what is broken. It is, to paraphrase Rami Shapiro's poem on Teshuvah, to concern ourselves with turning from ignorance to truth, from darkness to light, from evil to good, from conceit to compassion, from self to life. This pandemic will run its course until a vaccine is found, and we will have to find a way to live in the long shadow it casts over us, and to overcome the fear it evokes in us. We cannot again close down the world and confine families to tower blocks for months at a time. depriving children of their education. We cannot see men and women lose their jobs, their homes, and scores of people out on the streets this winter, hungry and cold, and begging for money and food. We cannot risk again the rising cases of abuse against women or the desperation of asylum seekers, all but forgotten and hidden from our sight. We cannot risk submerging the principles and values that make us conscious of each other, of the hidden, the marginalized, the workers, the trafficked, the hungry, the homeless poor, and the oppressed, the very people of whom Isaiah speaks in the Haftarah we will hear tomorrow in our service. We must find our own light among the shadows, and we must find it first by conquering our fear. Al tira ki imcha ani, al tishta ki ani Elohecha, imatzticha af azarticha, af tamachticha, binin sidki. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not frightened, for I am your God. I strengthen you and I help you. I uphold you with my right hand, the hand that shows you the way of righteousness. These too are the words of Isaiah, the prophet who voices God's comforting presence and compassion towards his people. This exhortation to Israel to be not afraid, to conquer fear, to be God's witnesses, is a call to each one of us to live not in retreat from others, but consciously and intentionally, to live as well as we can with responsibility and in righteousness. Now, as we begin this Yom Kippur, for so many of us, a different kind of experience this year, let each one of us find the courage to overcome our fear. For when we have subdued unease with this uncertainty of our existence, then we can begin to repair the injustice in the world. We can make peace with those whom we have hurt. We can restore the person we wronged and find the image of a compassionate and tender God within us. Then we may look forward with confidence and hope to a new year of well-being and peace of mind. Kein yehi ratzon. May this be God's will, and let us say, Amen.